Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Bertrand, Senior Vice President, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. So, Tim, you missed the gala because you have COVID. How are you doing?
Well, I'm still calling in from my sick bed. My sick chair in my office, I suppose. I'm still positive, but I feel a lot better today. So I think I'm at the tail end of it, but I sound a lot better today. The cough has subsided. I didn't lose my sense of taste or smell. So that's, knock on wood, I did not have that. I definitely had low energy and the cough was kind of up and down throughout, but I guess I can tick off my bucket list and say, well, I've had COVID. But the irony of it, of course, was I was planning to go get the new Omicron booster this weekend. And I guess I don't need to get that for a little while now, but I would have much rather been at the gala. So what did I miss? How was it?
Well, I hate to tell you this, Tim, but it was really a fantastic evening. Peter Thiel and our MC, Steve Hayward, had a great rapport, really terrific conversation. We honored Professor Chiron Skinner of Pepperdine. And gosh, she gave a really great, for the 5-10 minutes that she had to speak, she really gave a great talk, the lay of the land on foreign policy. And I think we'll have to have her back for a luncheon or a reception. We also had Paul Wolfowitz. He ran the World Bank a few years back. And Steve Hilton from Fox News also came with his wife, Rachel Whetstone, who many of our listeners might know is a granddaughter of PRI's founder, Sir Anthony Fisher. Brian Daly was there. He's running for governor. And we also had some other candidates. So a lovely evening overall, Tim. Sorry.
The stars turned out, it sounds like.
That's right. Well, Tim, so the governor is now actually getting cost conscious here. So he vetoed a few bills, the mandatory kindergarten bill, a few others. He's obviously worried about the recession. And I actually read in one estimate that the state is about $4 billion behind in terms of revenue collection now. So, while we have a rainy day fund, it was virtually wiped out overnight in the last recession. So what are you hearing these days about what he's vetoing, what he's going to sign?
Well, first, a mea culpa. Last week, I predicted that he would veto the farm labor bill. Of course, he signed it. And he went outside with the farm workers and had a little tete-a-tete with them as he was signing it. So when we have our 10-year anniversary podcast, I guess I can add this prediction to the list of bad predictions that I have made over the years. What was interesting, there are some good bill signings. They're not all bad. For example, there was kind of a conservatorship reform bill in the wake of the Britney Spears saga. He signed that bill, and I think most people would argue that is a good thing. There is a bill to decriminalize jaywalking, which, gosh, if I added up the number of times I've jaywalked over the years, I'd owe a lot of money to the state. So that's probably a good thing as well. But then when you look at, kind of the priorities for California's big labor unions, they pretty much got just about everything they wanted except the big bill about unionizing the legislature. So and we're all going to experience that certainly with the franchise bill, AB 257, with, higher costs, fewer opportunities for all. I thought the most interesting thing, the governor put out this, I guess it was a press release on Sunday, championing all the kind of left-wing priority bills that he signed. And he decided to be cute with it. So he called it Bills, 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 like the song. And he went through all of these in kind of weird hipster way, all these bills. So for example, like when he wrote about the quote unquote pay equity bill, he wrote it, "She works hard for the money." When he wrote further down in his release, when he talked about stealing catalytic converters, there was a bill to address that. And the way he wrote about it was, "To your aunt who had her catalytic converter stolen." So I don't know who he was referring to in these sorts of things. Later on, there was a bill about street vendors that he signed, and it was presented as "To your BFF who wants a hot dog at 1 a.m. So,
well, Tim, as former speechwriters, I'm beginning to think that that's kind of clever. because you go through these speeches and you drone out, sign this, I sign that. It gets a little dull. And if you can try to find ways to be clever about it, it's kind of fun.
Well, and we've written 1,000 of these sorts of speeches and press releases on bill signings, and they are certainly boring to say the least. So I guess that's his way to try to break through and highlight, what he thinks is a wonderful record that obviously young people and people who are disinterested in politics are going to appreciate. I don't think we've seen a press release like that since back in the day when Arnold Schwarzenegger vetoed a bill by Tom Amiano, who was one of his biggest critics. And the veto message, now obviously staff writes the veto messages. If you looked at it, the first letters of each line starting out added up to a 4-letter word starting with the letter F. So it still is legendary that they was able to write a veto message in that way. And that was certainly a message to the author of the bill. So, not since that have we seen a signing or veto message like this. So, but yes, so now you can officially watch your wallets, breathe a sigh of relief. The legislature will be out of session until January. So no more bill signings for a while.
So let's talk about our next guest, Nick Loris, who is a rising star in the environmental and energy research space. And we have had him before and got rave reviews on it. So Tim, you caught up with him at the State Policy Network annual meeting.
Yes. And I always think it's kind of cool when we can go on location and bring you some of these great individuals to give their perspective. And you'll hear all the fun we had in the background. There was a little jazzy quartet going on the other side of the room. But Nick is really a national leader on free market energy policy. He used to be at Heritage Foundation. He's now with a group called C3 Solutions. And we talk about all the hot issues with energy policy, nuclear, gas prices. What are we going to expect this winter? All the push over green energy. I think it's a really interesting discussion of all things energy policy related. So if you're interested in any of these subject areas, this is your show to geek out on.
Well, thanks so much for listening, everyone. And here is Nick and Tim.
Well, we're here at State Policy Network annual meeting here in the Connections Lounge, which I wish you all were here to see. We're sitting between two giant fern plants, and there's some lovely faux greenery around, and there's a folk singer performing in the corner that you might be able to hear in the background. But we're here with our young old friend, Nick Loris, who you've heard before, many times at our events and as a guest on our podcast. So, Nick, since we talked to you last, you've taken a new position with the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, or C3. This is a case where an acronym is good because we'd never remember all of those things. So, for our listeners who may not be familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Well, thanks, Tim. It's great to be with you. Always great to connect and be here at SPN. C3 Solutions is a new think tank based in Washington, D.C. It's about 2.5 years old, and it generated from a few folks that I knew in the energy and conservation space. One guy who worked at the Department of Energy under the Bush administration and was Dr. Ed Follner, the former president of the Heritage Foundation's chief of staff back in the day, too, and another guy who owns a sustainable farm out in Maryland. And they started this think tank about 2.5 years ago, recognizing that we need solutions that focus on energy affordability, energy security, but also help reduce emissions. I know when you talk about climate solutions from the right, a lot of people get a little nervous. Because for too long, climate solutions have been synonymous with more regulations, more taxes on the American people, more subsidies, all of these things that adversely impact the economy, that impact households, and really do little to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And so we really kind of want to flip the script on this and say, yes, we care about affordable, reliable energy. We think that the best way to reduce emissions globally is to make clean energy cheap, and we want to to have climate solutions and environmental solutions that are consistent with free market principles, ranging everything from good tax policy, permitting reform, forest management, which I know folks in California are all too familiar with the challenges there. All of these policies are good for the economy, they're good for the environment, and they can help reduce emissions.
So let's dive into some of your most recent work. As we've documented at PRI with our recent CEQA Gauntlet study, and for those of our listeners who haven't seen it, go check it out and see our great chart showing the mess that is California Environmental Quality Act. Government regulations, argued in the spirit of protecting the environment, are even holding up projects to achieve clean energy goals as favored by Governor Newsom and President Biden. So in recent weeks, we've seen this whole fight over the push for federal permitting reform to streamline clean energy projects being strenuously opposed, surprisingly, by the likes of Bernie Sanders, who I think has never met a climate change initiative he didn't like. So kind of doesn't really make sense when you look at it from the outside. So what's going on here? Shouldn't congressional liberals really be strongly supporting these efforts to jumpstart clean energy projects? What's the backstory here?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's kind of the fundamental tension right now between, I would say, economic progress, energy infrastructure for all types of energy forms, including for renewables, for battery technologies, and for nuclear. We have, the federal equivalent of CEQA, the National Environmental Policy Act, that's been a real headache for energy projects, and it's disproportionately impact renewable and clean energy projects. And so, there's been I would argue a coalition of folks on the right more concerned about this for a long time, that these policies put in place, more than 50 years ago are outdated, they're antiquated, and they've failed to keep up with technological and economic progress. And so we want to reform them to make it easier, more transparent, and more efficient to permit these projects to get the energy that people need, but also make environmental gains. And so you saw some of those reforms under the Trump administration. The Biden administration, regrettably, is trying to walk them back. But there is somewhat of a broader coalition building, which I think is positive on the center right and the center left. Folks like Ezra Klein, a New York Times columnist, has criticized NEPA as being a real obstacle to clean energy infrastructure. The Bloomberg editorial board recently talked about the impediments that NEPA imposes for hydrogen, for hydroelectricity, for nuclear. All of these things are frustrated by a long and onerously long permitting process. And for those folks on the left who say, climate change is this imminent catastrophic threat and we need to act within 10 years. Well, in the United States, it takes about 10 years to permit and build some of these projects. And that's very frustrating for those who want to see these projects built a lot faster and be more on par with countries like Australia and Canada, who have permitting processes in 2 to 3 years. That's what we should be aiming for. And it can be good for all types of energy, clean energy, fossil fuels, because the other point that I think is worth stressing is the less we produce here from an oil and gas standpoint, that's only going to offshore that production to countries with higher emissions profiles, worse environmental standards. And so we're not actually fixing any type of environmental problem by offshoring this production to dirtier countries. We're actually making the problem worse. So the more that we can, make American energy economically competitive through an efficient permitting process for mining, for transmission lines, and for all of this generation, the better off we're going to be economically and environmentally.
It's no surprise. We've all experienced this summer California and the whole country facing record gas prices, and sounds like we may not be through with them. So while prices have come down a little bit, they're still much higher than when President Biden took office. So given our current policy mix, where do you see gas prices going in the short and long term? And what policy reforms, if any, do you recommend that Congress or the Biden administration consider to keep gas prices more affordable?
Yeah, energy prices and gas prices have really been on the forefront of Americans' minds throughout the summer. It's changed some behavior. People have taken shorter vacations. When gas prices are high, that means other income isn't available to spend on food and housing and healthcare. And so it really has a significant impact on American families, disproportionately impacting low-income families who spend a higher percentage of their income on energy costs. And so, there's a lot that needs to be done, I would argue, both in the near term and in the intermediate to longer term to increase our abundance of supplies here in the United States. Unfortunately, there's not any good overnight solution to bring gas prices down to, that more sweet spot of $2, $2.50 per gallon. There are some policies that I think could help, like lifting the Jones Act, which is a very old, more than century-old law that stipulates that any good carried from U.S. port to U.S. port must be done on a U.S.-built, U.S. crewed vessel, and that has driven up the cost because foreign tankers could carry crude oil from Texas up to the Northeast at a discounted price, but it's artificially inflated as a result of that policy. The ethanol mandate, a Bush-era policy that from 2005 and then expanded in 2007, has driven up the price of a gallon of gasoline, and it stipulates that we need to blend ethanol, primarily corn-based ethanol, into our fuel supply, and not necessarily anything wrong with biofuels, but again, this mandate has driven up costs, and multiple studies, both by the federal government but also in academia, have concluded that it has had minimal to no environmental benefit too, from a pollution standpoint and from a greenhouse gas emissions standpoint. So those are two of the kind of regulatory fixes we could have happen overnight that could bring down the cost a little bit. Again, I think the more fundamental policy reforms that we need to have is have the business and regulatory certainty to allow these investments for new oil and gas plays to happen, because on federal lands, the Biden administration has dragged on with leases offshore and onshore, and that doesn't provide the regulatory and business certainty to invest in new development. And if you look again at a project like Keystone XL that was supposed to bring 830,000 barrels of crude oil down from Texas to the Gulf Coast refineries, it's that company, it's TC Energy, it was TransCanada at the time, first applied for that permit back in the summer of 2008. The first Iron Man movie was out, and we went through a whole list of Marvel movies, and we still don't have that pipeline. And so that just creates a lot of business uncertainty as well. And so for the intermediate to longer term, I really need to think we need to have those policies that help access our abundance of resources here in the U.S. to bring down crude oil prices. I know you asked in the beginning where I think those prices will go, and I think it's always difficult to make those guesses. And if I had to venture, maybe $90 to $100 a barrel throughout this winter. It could go lower, maybe potentially 80, but I think it'll stick around in that range if I had to guess.
And for our listeners who are interested about the Jones Act, we've had a great discussion on a past podcast with our friend Kali'i Akina from the Grassroot Institute in Hawaii, and I saw him the other day here at SPN, and it doesn't only hurt oil, it hurts all kinds of goods and services for Hawaii. I believe Puerto Rico is also heavily affected by that, so definitely it may sound like an in-the-weeds thing, but it's a really critically important law to reform or repeal altogether. So we're seeing that energy, of course, isn't just a U.S. problem these days. It's a global problem. Our Vladimir Putin's musings are certainly have energy markets rattling. You see in the UK, people are facing massive power bills and the government struggling to respond to that. In a recent interview, you argued that this global energy crisis is a real threat to human life. Maybe you could explain to our listeners your thinking here and how free markets can pave the way for our clean energy future and help, people around the world far more effectively than the government mandates we typically see.
Yeah, what's happening in Europe is truly devastating, and the prices have increased in some instances 100-fold. Businesses and manufacturers are shutting down and furloughing employees, and a lot of countries have committed to building up their natural gas inventories because that's what's going to help them get through the winter. And a lot of countries are legitimately concerned not just about the businesses shutting down, but also having enough power and enough energy to heat their homes throughout the winter. And so that's why it truly is a matter of life and death. And we've seen when the power goes out and it's cold, especially for older populations, it can be very problematic, if not fatal. And so this has been a bit of a long time coming. A lot of folks, I think, in the free market community have long argued that Europe is too dependent on Russian natural gas, and now we're seeing the consequences of that. And I think it's truly free markets that will help Europe out of this mess through energy diversification and energy choices. And the United States can be a big problem solver in that regard too. We've been shipping more liquefied natural gas and exporting it to Europe. We need to build more of that infrastructure to ship even more and make do on our commitments to help Europe out of this mess. But there's just been a lot of self-inflicted wounds that have exacerbated this crisis. Germany's energy transition and shutting down its nuclear plants has exacerbated the problem, and now they're returning to coal. Some areas are returning to oil and diesel generation to get through this mess. I think thinking through the, again, more longer-term solutions, because this, according to most analysts, is not just about this winter, but it might be multiple winters before Europe truly gets out of this mess, is through increasing their own supplies. It was good to see the new British Prime Minister talking about opportunities to hopefully increase natural gas production and fracking in the UK. They should be increasing their own supplies. They should be expanding their efforts to build that energy infrastructure to import liquefied natural gas. And companies in America like NuScale, a Portland-based small modular nuclear reactor company, is working and committed to helping countries by building a number of small modular nuclear reactors in countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Czech, I believe Poland as well. And so there's some promising opportunities. What is going to get them out of that mess is open markets and having that receptiveness to the U.S. building that energy infrastructure through developing their own infrastructure and their own abundance of supplies. It's the markets that will get us out of that. If they continue down this path of reliance on Russia, but also committing to these very difficult to attain renewable energy mandates, it's going to lead to similar problems that they're experiencing now. And so, I think this is a rude wake-up call. We're all hoping that they get out of it sooner rather than later, but it really is going to be open markets and free enterprise that get us there faster than any government-stipulated policy that aims to restrict energy supplies or restrict consumers' ability to consume energy.
So, kind of on that point, certainly in California, in the U.S. in general, over the years, we've benefited greatly from cheap and cleaner and abundant natural gas. But you see these mandates from the Biden administration and state government that are discouraging natural gas production. And you've argued that even here we're going to face our own natural gas affordability crisis if we stay on this course. So maybe paint a picture for us of what we could expect at home. Just how burdensome could natural gas costs become for families and business owners really in the not too distant future, and how can we prevent that from happening?
The shale revolution has been, such an economic and environmental blessing for the United States, and I think paves the picture and is very good example of what free markets can do for the economy and for the environment. And natural gas prices, have been low for quite some time now. If you look at the Henry Hub spot price, it's been anywhere from $2 to $4 per million BTU, and now it's up closer to 9 and could be in that 8 to 10 range for the foreseeable future. But this has been really incredible for energy consumers. It's just helped them save a lot of money. We talked about the high cost of gas prices and how that reduces disposable income for other things. Well, the flip side of that is true too, is that when you pay less money for energy, you can spend it on other things. And not only does that give families more opportunities to go out to eat and go to the movies and go on vacation, but it also helps generate economic benefits to those communities. And as a result of the shale revolution and this cheap natural gas, we've seen a real manufacturing renaissance in the United States too, because natural gas is an important feedstock for a lot of chemical manufacturing processes and industrial processes. And so, even in spite of some of our bad regulatory policies and, preceding the Trump years, the bad tax policies, we've still had manufacturers locating in the United States because of that cheap natural gas. And so what the policymakers need to focus on is making sure, again, the government stays out of the way. There's been policy reforms to ensure that fracking is regulated at the state level, for instance, which they've done a very good job of for the most part. They've done a good job of keeping up with the technology, making sure that they adjusted regulations to assuage any concerns and minimize environmental impacts. And again, it's helped the United States reduce emissions. And I think it shows that economic growth and environmental productivity, emissions reductions can go hand in hand, and that should be the model, not just for the United States, for the rest of the world. Too often, climate policy is really focused around this degrowthism, that we need to trap people in poverty or that consumption is bad, and a lot of times it's technology and consumption that makes our lives better, but also improves the environment.
So California, not surprisingly, is inspiring the Biden administration in their push for government energy mandates. We just saw Secretary Jennifer Granholm and Secretary Pete Buttigieg were interviewed about our electric car policies, and they say that California's policies are just right. But as we've documented at PRI, of course, these policies impose huge costs on working class and minority communities. So while the dust is really still settling after the Inflation Reduction Act, it's clear the primate provisions in that bill are just the beginning. So I'm going to ask you to use your crystal ball again. If Democrats maintain control of Congress after the election, what do you see as the next California-style energy policy that could really gain a lot of traction and be enacted at the federal level?
I think the Biden administration is going to focus with Congress on something President Obama said back in the day when he said, I have a phone and a pen, and really lean on his executive agencies to carry out a lot of the regulatory reforms that the administration wants to see. And, as anyone who's paying attention in the energy and climate space knows, it's not really just the Environmental Protection Agency regulations that you have to worry about. It's now, the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's the Department of Interior. It's the Department of Energy. There's a laundry list of agencies who now have to focus on climate policy because President Biden talked about using a whole of government approach. And so, that's something that, will continue through 2024. Obviously, who knows what's going to happen in 2024 with the presidential election, but it's going to be much more focused on, kind of the stick approach rather than what we've seen in the Inflation Reduction Act, which has been largely carrots, $369 billion worth of carrots for all sorts of energy technologies and green subsidies. There were some sticks in the IRA bill too, changing royalty rates for oil and gas production on federal lands and reimposing an oil tax for Superfund sites, things like that. But it's really focused on a lot of green subsidies. And so, I think what's going to be important, ideally for both sides of the aisle to focus on, is transparency and oversight more than anything else, is because there's going to be a lot of money coming out the door. What we saw under the Obama stimulus was a lot of that money being wasted or given to companies that their balance sheets didn't look too good, but they still got the money and then went belly up, or that they overcharged grossly for weatherization projects. And so transparency and oversight, not just coming out of the federal government through government accountability reports, but really at the state and local level, to ensure that if this money is being spent, it's spent efficiently, effectively, and transparently is going to be critical. And I think any person who cares about good governance should care about this issue.
So, of course, California was recently on the brink of mass power outages with our recent record heat wave, and we avoided blackouts, certainly thanks to conservation, but the state also had to go out in the market and at the most expensive prices and get additional non-clean energy power sources to keep the lights on. And many are fearing that what's going to happen a few decades down the road when we have this theoretical 100% renewable power grid in California on the books and the gas car ban in place. So do you think this experience that we just had will serve as a wake-up call nationally, or are we inevitably on the path to, kind of experiencing, cross your fingers, let's hope we have enough power to keep the lights on each day and power our cars at night when we're all charging at the same time?
It's a real strange feeling thinking that these are problems in America in 2022. I mean, we've been fortunate in most of the United States that we take energy for granted, that we can cool our homes in the summer and heat them in the winter, and that we can get to work and school affordably and efficiently. And this over-reliance through subsidies and market distortions is very problematic. And there's been a lot of cross-subsidization through regulations at the federal and state policy that have exacerbated these problems. And again, too much of a focus on specific technologies. To me, if you care about global greenhouse gas emissions and if you care about emissions reductions generally, you shouldn't focus on a 100% renewable energy mandate, knowing that there's intermittency issues there, that you're going to need some sort of firm thermal generation anyway, and it's probably going to take a while for batteries to get there, and certainly to be cost effective. You should focus on energy affordability, energy reliability, coupled with emissions reductions. That's, I think, the path forward. And the more we have these rolling brownouts and blackouts and people are without power, I mean, nothing riles people up faster than when they can't watch Netflix at night, but nothing riles them up even more when you're talking about, are we going to get through this winter, as places like Texas has seen. I think it's going to be a real challenge because there's a lot of regulatory agencies at play at the federal and state level who focus on energy infrastructure and energy reliability, and there needs to be better interagency coordination for these activities. But I do think some of what's happening now should serve as that stark wake-up call so we don't end up in a situation like Europe. And I don't want to be hyperbolic by any means, but if we continue down this path of picking winners and losers, of not reforming regulations to allow for new infrastructure investments and new energy transmission lines and compressor stations and all the stuff that we know is necessary to deliver energy to consumers, these situations are only going to get worse, and it's not just going to be in California.
So dovetailing that on energy, we've been debating in California the future of our last nuclear power plant, Diablo Canyon on the Central Coast, which was scheduled to go offline in a few years. And I believe it's something like 7 or 8% of the power grid each day, comes from that one plant. And state officials led by a potential future presidential candidate realized, nuclear power is important to keeping the lights on, and they moved to extend the life of the plant this legislative session. But you're also seeing an interesting thing. Public opinion was so diametrically opposed to nuclear in California, and now you're seeing a plurality of Californians for the first time in public opinion polling this year saying they support nuclear power. So what do you see as nuclear's future, both in California and going forward? Are we at the dawn of a new nuclear age, or are we going to have to keep our fingers crossed that solar and wind are going to keep the lights on?
The shift has been encouraging, and I see a bright future for nuclear, not just in the United States, but around the world. And it's hard-pressed to find people who are serious about climate change who don't think nuclear needs to be part of the energy solution. Yes, there are folks who believe it should be 100% renewable energy, but most serious energy economists, most of the climate scientists that I've talked to and read, think that is a costly and implausible scenario. And so the choice to keep Diablo Canyon online was encouraging. The public shift toward nuclear power is certainly encouraging. And I think what's also perhaps most encouraging is all the different innovative technologies that are out there to build SMR technologies. I mentioned NuScale in the beginning of this podcast, but there's Oklo, which is a California-based reactor that is almost like a micro nuclear reactor that will run on spent nuclear fuel, which is great because there's a lot of energy in that nuclear waste or spent fuel. And so there's these different type of reactor technologies that will really go a long way to, I think, help with the cost reduction. And if you don't need to build one of these big 1,000 megawatt reactors like we have here in the United States, that these will be a little more nimble, a little more flexible. They'll still be just as safe, if not safer, than the already safe reactors that we have here in the United States. I think too many people kind of reflexively dismiss nuclear as, it's too expensive. We haven't built one in the United States for a long time. I think part of the problem is we don't really know what the future of nuclear looks like because we haven't created the regulatory process to allow for these plants to come online efficiently and build out the economies of scale to reduce those costs. And so with all of these SMR technologies that are out there, again, not just U.S. companies, but some encouraging ones in Korea and Japan and elsewhere, I think there's a real opportunity to make nuclear an even bigger part of the energy mix in the U.S. and around the world. And again, that can be compatible not just with America and the world's energy needs, but also emission targets and trying to reduce emissions throughout the world.
So finally, as we close, I want to give you another chance to show off some of your good work. So as we're looking at this future of the debate over energy policy, it's important to look at where voters stand. And I know you all have done some polling recently in swing states, which I think has some really interesting results on what voters and Republicans in particular are thinking about climate issues. So share with us some of your findings in your survey.
Yeah, these voters are really encouraged by things like nuclear power, by carbon capture. I think they are interested about climate change and want to care more about climate change, increasingly more so, but don't want to pay a whole lot for it. And this is consistent with polling that we've seen in the past from other organizations that, if you ask voters broadly, they're not willing to pay more than $1 per month on their electricity bill to combat climate change. And so our organization, again, is focused on energy and environmental policies rooted in economic freedom, and they tend to poll very well with these voters, thinking about things like permitting reform. They get excited by things like that and ways to actually increase opportunities and lower costs for nuclear power and carbon capture. I think this is what potentially excites voters, understanding that it's not just a renewable energy versus fossil fuels and nuclear. It's an all of the above energy approach. And to me, all of the above should mean allowing these technologies to compete in the free market, and whichever can provide the lowest cost, affordable, reliable energies are the ones that should succeed and thrive in the marketplace. Too often in Washington, all of the above means subsidize all of the above, or all of the above the ground but nothing below the ground, so we can't mine or drill and use some of the resources that we know provide the overwhelming majority of energy in the U.S. and around the world. So I'm encouraged by these voters and how they view energy and climate policy, and it's very synonymous, which is nice for us, about our policy reforms, because our general overall message is that free economies are clean economies, and the countries that do well on indices of economic freedom, whether that's from the Heritage Foundation or from the Fraser Institute in Canada, also tend to have the highest scores from an environmental performance ranking. Yale University does a very good index of all of these different metrics on environmental performance, and these are highly correlated, economic growth and environmental performance. And people have more income, they can dedicate more to environmental protection, there's more innovation and technology happening in freer economies, and that helps bend pollution curves downward, but also increases economic growth. Private property rights are instrumental in environmental protection. So I think all the things that conservatives and libertarians love about economic freedom, is the ultimate path forward in the United States and around the world to meet our energy needs and our environmental targets.
Well, Nick, this was great catching up with you, connecting in the Connections Lounge. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope to have you back soon.
Anytime. It's great to be with you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.